England stood on the edge of a second Reformation, and Edward VI, a boy king destined to die young, was holding the torch. In real history, Edward died at just 15, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to abrupt religious whiplash. Mary I's rise brought a fierce Catholic restoration, burnings at Smithfield, and a sharp reversal of Edward's Protestant reforms. Only after her death did Elizabeth I stabilize England and craft a more balanced settlement. But imagine a different path. A healthy, long-reigning Edward VI, intelligent, devout, politically assertive, guiding England through a decisive Protestant transformation. His survival could permanently alter the monarchy, the Church of England, and the fate of Europe. To understand what Edward might become, we must understand the world he inherited and the boy he actually was. Before he was a king of paper and counselors, Edward VI was a prodigy, arguably the smartest Tudor ever born. To understand the alternate future in which Edward survives into adulthood, we must first understand the remarkable child who actually wore the crown. Though history remembers him as a pale, sickly boy overshadowed by ambitious regents, the real Edward was far more complex, sharp-minded, fiercely religious, politically observant, and astonishingly disciplined for someone barely into his teenage years. From early childhood, Edward's education was nothing short of elite. Henry VIII surrounded him with humanist scholars, Richard Cox, John Cheek, and the great Protestant thinker Thomas Cranmer. Together they shaped the prince into a classically trained intellectual fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and even some Italian. Edward devoured theological texts, studied classical histories, and engaged in debates on scripture with an ease that baffled even his tutors. This wasn't the typical grooming of a royal heir, it was the making of a philosopher king. By 10, Edward could write with academic precision. By 12, he was keeping a structured journal analyzing politics, finance, and foreign affairs. His notes reveal a boy who took kingship seriously, far more seriously than his elders expected. Personality-wise, Edward combined curiosity, meticulousness, and a surprisingly cold rationality. He was not warm or charismatic like his father. Instead, he was detail-oriented, stern, and deeply committed to order. Edward had little patience for laziness, corruption, or what he viewed as moral weakness. While still a child, he criticized nobles for seeking profit above the realm, showing an awareness of court politics that most teenagers would never possess. These traits signaled something crucial. Edward did not plan to remain a puppet king. Religiously, Edward was a zealot in the literal historical sense. While Henry VIII broke from Rome for political convenience and Elizabeth I later crafted a moderate middle way, Edward wanted a full, uncompromising Protestant transformation. Influenced heavily by Cranmer and the Continental reformers, he championed iconoclasm, English liturgy, and the destruction of what he saw as Catholic superstition. If he had lived, England's religious settlement would not have been cautious or diplomatic, it would have been fierce, direct, and ideologically absolute. Many historians agree, no Tudor monarch was more Protestant than Edward VI. Yet Edward's worldview was shaped equally by conflict. His childhood was dominated by power struggles between the Seymour brothers and later the Dudley faction. Edward watched as Protector Somerset rose and fell, as Dudley maneuvered viciously through the council, and as political infighting threatened the stability of his kingdom. Far from being oblivious, Edward documented these tensions. He learned how power worked, where loyalty failed, and how a king must be firm to control ambitious nobles. These early experiences gave him something rare: political instincts sharpened by witnessing the throne's vulnerabilities up close. In the real timeline, Edward never escaped these factions. His health collapsed, his authority remained limited, and his reign ended before his character could fully shape the monarchy. But the alternate scenario, Edward surviving, reaching 18, and taking full command, would have unleashed a king who already possessed strong ideological certainty, intellectual confidence, and a clear vision for England's future. He would not have governed like the gentle Edward of schoolbook summaries. He would have ruled like a reformer determined to finish what he believed God had entrusted him to begin. So who is Edward when he reaches adulthood? Not the dying boy king we remember, but a Tudor king in his prime? The answer reshapes everything that follows. A living Edward VI doesn't just continue the Reformation, he ignites one of the most radical religious transformations in Europe. To understand the scale of change, imagine an England ruled not by a teenager on his deathbed, but by a confident, educated, deeply ideological young king with total control over his church and state. With Edward surviving into adulthood, the English Reformation becomes something far more intense, far more uncompromising, and far more permanent than anything seen in our timeline. Edward had grown up absorbing the ideas of the most militant reformers of the age. Calvinist theology, strict moral discipline, and a belief in the absolute authority of Scripture shaped his worldview. This wasn't a monarch interested in half measures or political compromise. This was a king who saw the Bible as the constitution of his realm. So the moment he reached adulthood, the Reformation would accelerate at a speed and depth England had never witnessed. England would transform into what many historians might call a Protestant superstate. Churches stripped of every ornamental trace, stained glass shattered, altars torn down, elaborate rituals abolished. Any lingering resemblance to Catholic England, something Elizabeth would later preserve for stability, would vanish entirely. The Book of Common Prayer, already radical under Cranmer, would evolve even further. Under Edward's direction, it would become harsher in tone, more openly hostile toward Catholic doctrine, and more aligned with Calvinist theology. Even kneeling for communion, a practice Elizabeth later restored for symbolic reverence, would likely disappear. The result is a national church that resembles Geneva more than Canterbury, strict, austere, moralistic, and firmly controlled by the crown. Edward never trusted bishops as independent authorities. He believed they should answer directly to the monarch. So he would reorganize the Church of England's hierarchy, reducing bishoprics, creating state-appointed superintendents, and building a church structure that operated like a political institution. In his England, religion and royal authority become indistinguishable. The church would essentially function as an instrument of state power, enforcing doctrine, morality, and social behavior with intense discipline. One of the most dramatic consequences of Edward's survival is the complete erasure of Mary I's reign. No Catholic restoration, no burnings at Smithfield, no wave of executions that traumatized England and turned Mary into Bloody Mary in the public imagination. Without Mary, there is no violent religious whiplash. Catholicism doesn't resurface, it is crushed before it even has a chance. Instead of becoming a firestorm of religious conflict, England under Edward marches steadily deeper into radical Protestant identity. And with Mary gone, Elizabeth's role changes completely. There is no need for her middle way, the clever balancing act that allowed Catholic aesthetics to survive under a Protestant doctrine. In this timeline, that compromise never occurs. Edward simply doesn't permit it. He believed compromise was weakness, and he saw religious unity as a divine mandate. So England becomes the most aggressively Protestant nation in Europe, far surpassing even Scotland or the German states. Catholicism becomes an underground relic, illegal, dangerous, and socially toxic. For generations, it would survive only in hiding. This extreme religious vision would also reshape England's foreign relations. Free from regents and finally acting on his own convictions, Edward would forge a block of alliances with Protestant powers. Lutheran princes in Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and reformers in Switzerland would all find in him a powerful ally. England becomes not just a Protestant nation but a Protestant leader, an international force promoting and protecting reform movements across the continent. Edward would likely funnel money and weapons to rebels in the Netherlands or Huguenots in France, positioning England as the ideological defender of Reformation Europe. That, however, pushes England into direct confrontation with Catholic superpowers. Spain, already alarmed by Protestant movements in its territories, would view Edward as a destabilizing threat. France, too, would find itself increasingly hostile, especially as Edward encouraged Protestant influence within its borders. Diplomatic tensions would spike. Military conflict becomes not just possible but increasingly likely. England under Edward VI becomes an ideological kingdom that carries its mission across borders, turning Protestant identity into a foreign policy weapon. Edward's reforms wouldn't stop at religion or diplomacy. His writings reveal a young man obsessed with economic discipline and order. He criticized his father's reckless debasement of the coinage and demanded a return to financially stable currency. As an adult, he would enforce strict coinage reform, restoring proper weight and purity to English currency years before Elizabeth historically stabilized it. That alone could pull England out of economic crisis far earlier. He also hated corruption. In his journals, he condemned nobles who exploited the crown and officials who enriched themselves at the kingdom's expense. As king, he would launch aggressive anti-corruption campaigns, punish illegal enclosure of land, and enforce market regulation rooted in Protestant moral ethics. Grain prices, wool exports, labor conditions, Edward would intervene in all of them with the belief that a morally upright nation must also be economically just. England becomes not only religiously disciplined but economically disciplined as well. All these changes create a striking contrast with real history. In our timeline, England's religious identity lurches from Henry's confusion to Edward's brief radicalism to Mary's Catholic resurgence before settling under Elizabeth's careful moderation. It's a pendulum that swings violently for decades. But in this alternate timeline, the pendulum never moves. Edward lives, reigns, and locks England into a single, uncompromising Protestant identity, shaping the nation's character for centuries. But a powerful king does not rule alone, and Edward's marriage, heirs, and political alliances could rewrite the Tudor dynasty itself. A surviving Edward VI doesn't just reshape England, he reshapes the entire Tudor family tree. When a monarch lives who was never meant to reach adulthood, every marriage, every alliance, and every heir that follows creates a completely new timeline. In this world, the Reformation isn't the only thing transformed. The dynasty itself mutates into something unrecognizable compared to the England we know. One of the first and most consequential decisions Edward must make as an adult king is marriage. And here, his options are dramatically shaped by religion. Edward is not a diplomatic politician like Elizabeth, willing to balance Protestant identity with Catholic diplomacy. He is a Puritan-leaning Protestant idealist, and that idealism dictates his marriage strategy. A Catholic bride is virtually impossible. Elizabeth of Valois, a French Catholic princess, might be offered in theory, but Edward would reject her instantly. He would see such a match as compromising the spiritual purity of the realm. Instead, his advisors, especially men like William Cecil or John Dudley, would push for alliances that strengthen England's Protestant identity. The Scandinavian kingdoms become obvious targets. A Swedish or Danish princess offers not only shared religion but also potential naval alliances. Edward admired strong, disciplined nations, and Lutheran Scandinavia fit that mold perfectly. But even more likely than that is a German bride. Edward grew up studying continental Protestant theology. He read Melanchthon, respected the Saxon reformers, and held deep admiration for the German princes who defied the Holy Roman Empire. A princess from Saxony, Württemberg, or Hesse would give Edward exactly what he wants: a religiously pure union and a powerful ideological alliance. There is also the English option, Lady Jane Grey. Brilliant, devoutly Protestant, and politically convenient. Marrying her would keep power within the Protestant aristocracy and eliminate any future challenge from the Grey family. But Jane is a dangerous choice too. She comes from a factional, ambitious lineage, and tying himself to them could backfire. Edward, observant as always, would likely avoid that kind of internal entanglement. He wants stability, not more rivalries. So the most probable outcome is a German Protestant princess, creating a Tudor-Saxon alliance that alarms every Catholic power in Europe. But the true shockwave comes with the birth of Edward's sons. A healthy Edward VI having 1, 2, or even 3 sons means the entire Tudor future is rewritten. There is no reign of Mary I. There is no Elizabethan Golden Age. The entire succession freezes in place around Edward's direct male line. For another century, England is ruled by Protestant Tudor kings formed not by compromise but by Edward's uncompromising theology. The ripple effects are enormous. Parliament becomes shaped by long-term Protestant priorities rather than alternating Catholic and Protestant monarchs. English identity becomes more tightly bound to the Reformation. Even English culture, its literature, politics, and national myths, evolves around the idea of a chosen Protestant destiny. Edward's sons don't just secure the dynasty, they redefine what it means to be English. But what happens to Elizabeth in this world? She is one of the brightest, most politically skilled figures of the Tudor age, yet without a vacancy on the throne, she becomes something different, something far less legendary. If Edward trusts her moderate Protestantism, she becomes a diplomatic treasure. A marriage between Elizabeth and a Protestant prince, perhaps in the Palatinate, Denmark, or Sweden, could solidify alliances. She may even become England's chief cultural ambassador, a powerful voice at court, and a respected advisor in matters of language, philosophy, or diplomacy. But if Edward sees her moderation as weakness, if he believes her approach to religion is too cautious, she becomes a problem. Not a threat to the throne, but a potential center of a soft faction, supported by nobles who prefer Elizabeth's more flexible worldview. Edward, who despised ambiguity, might respond by tightening control over her movements, shaping her court appointments, or using marriage as a way to neutralize any political danger she represents. Instead of becoming the Virgin Queen, she becomes a European pawn, shipped off to strengthen alliances rather than rule a kingdom. Her destiny transforms from sovereign to strategic asset. In this timeline, the great Elizabethan era never exists because the conditions that created it never arise. Mary's fate is even more complex. As a devout Catholic and the older half-sister of a fiercely Protestant king, Mary becomes politically radioactive. She is the one person whose existence threatens the ideological purity of Edward's England. But Edward is not Mary's father. He does not have Henry VIII's emotional ties. Instead, he has theological hostility. What happens to Mary depends entirely on how Edward balances religious fear with political caution. The gentlest version is quiet exile. Mary is sent to Spain or the Low Countries, married off to a Catholic noble house, and removed permanently from English affairs. She is treated as a diplomatic inconvenience rather than a rebel. Another possibility is enforced isolation within England, allowed to live, but closely monitored, prevented from gathering supporters, and kept far from public life. Edward could justify it as protecting the realm from idolatry while avoiding open cruelty. But the darkest possibility is confrontation. If Mary openly resists Edward's reforms, if she refuses the new services, encourages Catholic worship, or becomes a symbol for Catholic nobles, Edward might act harshly. Not with the fiery spectacle of Mary's later burnings, but with the cold, administrative efficiency of a king who believes God's law overrides family ties. Imprisonment, forced removal from succession, or even permanent detainment becomes possible. Edward would see her not as a sister but as a theological threat. And this is where the alternate timeline's contrast becomes most striking. In real history, Elizabeth becomes one of the most influential monarchs in European history. Mary becomes a tragic but pivotal figure whose failures help define the Protestant identity of England. But in this world, both their stories are eclipsed. Edward's heirs dominate the stage and bury their sisters' legacies under generations of Protestant kings. Now, with a powerful king, strong heirs, and a radical New England taking shape, how does Europe react? A powerful Edward VI would terrify every Catholic kingdom in Europe. And that's exactly what happens in this alternate timeline. Edward's long reign doesn't just reshape England, it shakes the entire continent. Suddenly, the boy who once seemed too fragile to rule becomes the driving force behind a Europe-wide Protestant revolution. The first domino falls in the Spanish Netherlands. In our timeline, Protestant anger simmers for years before finally erupting. But under Edward, England actively arms, trains, and funds the rebels. English pamphlets flood Antwerp, English gold fuels underground churches, and English ships deliver secret weapon shipments along the coast. Spain finds itself fighting rebellion after rebellion, draining its armies, draining its treasury, and weakening its empire decades earlier than expected. France feels the shock next. A powerful, confident Edward puts enormous pressure on Scotland, supporting the lords of the congregation and fueling Scottish Protestantism with English money and diplomacy. French influence evaporates almost overnight. The Auld Alliance collapses early, leaving France strategically exposed and humiliated. The Catholic world reacts with fear, and then with force. The Counter-Reformation turns harder, harsher, and far more militarized. Spain tightens its grip, the papacy launches aggressive new campaigns, and the Holy Roman Empire begins a systematic crackdown. But instead of slowing Protestantism, this only deepens the divide. Europe transforms into a battleground of ideologies, with nations aligning not just by politics, but by faith. And at the center of it all stands England, no longer a secondary power waiting for Elizabeth to make it great, but a bold, assertive Protestant superpower decades ahead of schedule. Edward's England becomes the headquarters of European reform, printing banned books, hosting exiled thinkers, and pushing a cultural revolution that sweeps across borders. So what does all of this mean for England, and for the world Edward would eventually leave behind? One life saved in 1553 could have rewritten 500 years of English identity. Imagine Edward VI, no longer the frail boy king, but a powerful, ideological monarch guiding England with intellect, zeal, and uncompromising vision. The Reformation, under his hand, becomes far more radical, sweeping away lingering Catholic influence and embedding Protestantism permanently into every corner of English life. Elizabeth I never ascends the throne. Mary I never attempts a restoration. England emerges decades ahead as a Protestant powerhouse, shaping not only its own destiny but the balance of power across Europe. The Tudor dynasty continues through Edward's sons, securing a century of ideological continuity and political stability. Unlike the real timeline, where religion swings violently and powerful queens define the age, this alternate history sees a unified Protestant England rise swiftly and decisively. Edward VI's survival isn't just a historical twist, it's the birth of an entirely new England.